Hello, I want to have a casual chat with you about a book that I just finished reading and which I think is so good. It really deserves some book prize attention and a lot more readers because it is not only pleasurable and fun, it is really fun. I had such a good time reading this book, but it's also very meaningful on a number of different levels. And it is so interesting how it evokes the personalities of a number of different characters and creates such strong voices for them, but gives a really interesting insight and point of view on history and figures from the past and the effects of colonialism and a multi-ethnic society and the confluence of these things. And so it is The Lost Love Songs of Boysie Singh by Ingrid Persaud. And this story takes as its central figure of Boysie Singh, who is a real life historical figure in Trinidad from the early to mid 1900s and was a notorious gangster and club owner that was clubs that were involved in gambling, but also he got into a lot shadier dealings and was involved in or orchestrated the murders of many different people. So we find out at the very beginning of the novel, and by the way, look at the inside cover of this book. It's so beautiful and luminous, but it describes in the very beginning in a news report of showing that Boysie Singh was tried and convicted for being responsible for many different crimes, and he was executed because of that. So we know his fate in the very beginning, but then we discover how he got there. And she doesn't fictionalize his voice, but the lives and voices of four different women that were closely connected to him. And so through these different perspectives, we get an understanding of who he was, but also the lives of these four different women who are so fascinating and who have such interesting and distinct voices of their own. And I just loved following their story and how the plot unfolds through following these different perspectives. Now, I have to admit, it took me a while to get into this book. I mean, it's quite long, and because there are a number of different voices, I read it halfway through, and then I stopped. And I went back to the very beginning, not because I wasn't enjoying it, but I was reading some other books at the time. So I think I was slightly distracted and needed to concentrate on it a bit more and just to be able to recall details about these different women's lives to really then fully understand and get into the story. But also because Ingrid Persaud represents the dialect of these different women in these stories, and their voices are quite different and distinct from each other. But if you're not accustomed to this dialect, I think it gets takes a little while to get into it. But once I got into the rhythm of the language, I could really understand it and was so gripped by their stories and their voices. And so I think one of the characters, so there are four different women. So there is Popo, who was a former prostitute, and she becomes romantically involved with Boysie Singh and then gets involved in his business dealings. And there is Manalala, who knew Boysie Singh early on in his life, and they had a relationship and a son together. But then he sort of takes her for granted and just sort of sees her as the mother of his son. And there is Doris, who is sort of social climber, upwardly mobile individual, and has aspirations to really establish herself in society. Even though she comes from a humble background, she starts working as a maid, but then becomes Boysie Singh's wife. And there is Rosie, who is a store owner, and is having an affair with another woman, and she just sort of wants to be left to her own devices and work on her own business, but has to deal with Boysie Singh, partly for protection and partly because he supplies goods to her store, which she sells, and so gets sort of entangled in his life and his dealings in this way, but also like suffers because of that. And I think Rosie's voice was the one that I had the most difficulty of getting into, because her dialect is really heavy, and also because her plot line is, slightly aside from the other three women who are romantically involved with Boysie Singh. It felt like a bit difficult to get into and understand her character, but I think it's so interesting the way that Ingrid Persaud represents language in this way, and the dialect, and especially in the figure of Doris, who really modifies her language, and because she comes from these humble beginnings, but she really tries to work on her speech and to sound more posh. And it's really interesting how that's represented in the narrative, that she's constantly correcting herself and the words she uses, and so showing how language itself and speech is a real designation of class, and how there are distinctions in the Trinidadian society, based on the language that different people use, but also there are distinctions based on racial background and heritage and religious practices, and how that is represented in the different characters in different ways, and how there's colorism, and how that affects how people react to and stereotype each other over time, and how a lot of this is because of the after effects of colonialism, and how that has really impacted the society and the confluence of the citizens of Trinidad, who come from many different nations and cultures, and how that is all filtered into their experience and into them as individuals. And this is expressed in Boysie Singh himself, who has Indian heritage, but who touches upon many different cultures more as a way of moving through this society, quite often, rather than through any genuine sort of feeling for wanting to adopt these different cultural practices and beliefs, systems of beliefs, and it's so interesting how that plays out in the lives of the four different women whose voices we get over this period of time. And so I just found this so fascinating on a number of different levels, but also the drama and plot of this story, and how we get different pieces of the story through the different voices of these characters. I was totally gripped as things were revealed through of what Boysie Singh does, and the agency that these different women express in how they react to Boysie Singh, how they try to subtly undermine him and each other over a period of time, and try to manipulate Boysie Singh, but have to be very careful about it because he is a very dangerous individual. And so I just found that all so gripping, and it's really juicy storytelling, as well as having all of these different levels to it of showing social differences and conflicts in the story. So I just found that all so compelling, and made it such an enjoyable reading experience, as well as a multi-layered one. And also the way that Ingrid Persaud writes about romantic relationships and sex specifically, I feel is so original and striking and really refreshing in a lot of different ways. So part of Boysie Singh's character is he is shown to often be impotent, and how this manifests in his relationships with these different women, and how quite often when men experience this condition, it plays out in ways that are defensive. Like he feels like he needs to defend, his manhood, and this makes him, very defensive, but also sometimes very like violent, and feels like he needs to accumulate even more power to demonstrate that he is a real man when he is having difficulty in this way when trying to have intimate relations with these women, and the way that this is held by these women as a point of that they can sort of dig at him for this way, for not being able to really pull it off in the sack, and so I found that aspect like so refreshing, but also the way that desire manifests differently in these women's lives, and how Ingrid Persaud represents same-sex desire as well as heterosexual desire, and so shows many different levels of the workings of sex and sexuality that I just find so refreshing and really compelling to read about. Again, it makes it for really juicy storytelling, and so it's such a wonderful novel. It is quite long. It's over 500 pages long, but really didn't feel like a long book in that way. Even after reading it 1.5 times, I wanted to stay with the story and continue reading about these characters, because I was so engaged by their stories and their voices, and just the way Ingrid Persaud creates dialogue in her stories is just so wonderful, and really brings them alive, and so I loved reading this. And Ingrid Persaud's debut novel, Love After Love. So if you haven't read this book either, I'd highly recommend it, because I thought it was an incredible novel, just so beautiful, and works a lot in the same way as this book, in that it has very strong voices, very strong characters and characterizations, and ways of representing sex and sexuality in this way that I was so passionate about this book, and so I'm so glad that she's created this really fascinating and complex new novel that also deals with a famous historical figure from the past of Trinidad in this way, a really controversial figure, and made me want to go and read more about both this figure and the past of Trinidad, to learn more about this, but also just wanted to stay with these characters so much. So I hope if you've not read this book, you'll be motivated to give it a try and to read it, and again, I would urge you to really stick with it and stay with it, because once you get into the voices of these characters and language that it's used, it just flows so beautifully and is so compelling and gripping. And if you have read it, I'd love to discuss it with you more in the comments below. Roz, on her BookTube channel, she made a great video about this book too, so if you want to know another point of view about this book, and someone who had a positive reading experience of it, I'll link her video below. But such a great book, and I hope to see more readers talking about it and discussing it, because it is so good. And I hasten to emphasize, it is so much fun to read. So if you want a really fun reading experience and a book to get you back into reading, really recommend this. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.